Hello everybody, welcome to the first ever Investing for a Living screencast. My name is Paul Novell. I am the writer of the Investing for a Living.us blog, and I cover a lot of investing topics on my blog. A lot of them are quite advanced for definitely a small audience, and in the past I've gotten a lot of questions about more basic fundamental topics that I think it would be a screencast would be a good way to cover. Introduce some basic topics in a short amount of time, allow people to ask questions through the comments, and increase the understanding of these concepts. So for my first one, I decided to tackle the one I tackled in my very first post on the blog, which turns out to have been back in September of 2010, which I find hard to believe, but there you go, which is how much does it take to retire? So I'll try to keep these relatively short, so let's jump right in. So how much does it take to retire? Well, it turns out that you can withdraw about 4% per year from your portfolio. This is often called the 4% rule, the 4% rule of thumb, and it's also called the safe withdrawal rate, or SWR for short. And you'll see that in many articles. It's become quite a hot topic in the last few years, especially post the 2008 financial crisis. And you'll see that all over my blog. I talk about it with respect to all kinds of different portfolios, to a lot of more detailed studies, which I'll mention a little bit later. Looked at it another way, that means that you need 25 times your desired yearly spending in order to retire. How do they come up with the number 25? Well, it's simply 1 divided by 4%, or 1 divided by 0.04, which is 25. So for example, if you need $40,000 a year of spending to meet your needs, that means you need $1 million in assets in order to retire. If you need $50,000 a year of spending, that means you need $1.25 million in assets. Another way I like to look at it to make the calculations a little bit easier is that for every $10,000 of annual spending, you will need $250,000 in assets. So another example, if we needed $100,000 a year of spending, then we would need $2.5 million in assets. Okay, so that's the basics, the 4% rule of thumb, 25 times your annual spending. Now, where did they get these numbers? Well, the 4% rule is based on historical results. That means they go back to data from starting in 1929 all the way through last year, 2014, and for a 30-year retirement period. They look at a portfolio made up of 60% U.S. large cap stocks represented by the S&P 500 and 40% U.S. bonds. All right, then they withdraw a certain amount from the portfolio at the beginning of each year. So for example, starting with the 1929 retiree, and do that every single year for 30 more years, all the way, that would be through 1958. And do the same thing for the 1930 retiree, and then the 1931 retiree, etc., etc., etc. And then see what percentage rate allows that portfolio to survive. So this is using 100% success rate. That means in every 30-year retirement period starting in 1929, this 4% rule would have survived. Now think about that for a second. That means that even during the Great Depression and the Great Inflation of the 1970s, the 4% rule would have survived. Despite 1929 through early 1930, stocks losing over 80% of their value. And another example would be the late 1970s, early 1980s, with inflation reaching over 10% per year. So pretty robust numbers. Now what they do is that 4% rule, you withdraw from the portfolio and you adjust that spending every year by the inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And that also assumes no other sources of income. So based on these rules, that's how the 4% rule comes about. 60-40 U.S. stocks, bonds, 30-year retirement period, 100% success rate with spending adjusted for inflation every year in order to keep the real standard of living the same. Okay, now that does leave out a lot of other scenarios. So let's talk about some of the problems with the 4% rule. Well, one of the biggest issues is not every retirement period is 30 years. Some people it's 23, some people it's 20. For example, in my case, it's a lot longer than 30 years. So I have to adjust and use different numbers. One of the biggest issues as well is most people have other sources of income. Actually, almost everyone will have another source of retirement income when they reach their full retirement age, either at 66 or 67, which is Social Security. All right, so that should be taken into account for determining how much you can withdraw and how much you need to retire. Another issue is there are many different investment portfolios. The 4% rule is based on a 60-40% asset allocation model, U.S. stocks and U.S. bonds, but there are many other different portfolios. There are many investors with different risk tolerances that may not be able to tolerate that amount of risk, or it may be too little risk for them and have different needs. So we can look at different options there. Another issue is there are many different ways to plan on spending. Not all investors can use the inflation-adjusted spending. Some people need more. Some people have lump sums they will need to take in the future before the end of the 30-year retirement period. And some investors will spend less than inflation-adjusted spending. Actually, the data shows that most investors spend less than inflation-adjusted spending. Another issue is the future may not be the same as the past. So the 4% rule may have worked historically, but it may not necessarily work in the future. And that's been a very hot topic in the last couple of years. And what I'd like to do is cover these topics individually in some future screencasts, and it will give you a lot more information, a lot more confidence or not confidence about the 4% rule and maybe adjustments that you need to make for your own retirement. Okay, so with that being said, remember the summary here is you can withdraw 4% per year from your portfolio, and that means that you need 25 times your desired yearly spending in order to retire, with the assumptions I've given here. With that, that's it for the first screencast. Post your questions in the comments section, and I'll do my best to get back to you, and I'll also introduce the screencast on my blog. Thanks.